Picture this, a vast, sun-drenched plaza in ancient Rome, filled with tens of thousands of cheering citizens. At the center stands a man draped in purple, about to be crowned the most powerful person in the known world. The air crackles with anticipation, but also with tension, because in the shadows, rivals watch with envy, priests measure their influence, and assassins might be hiding in plain sight. This was the reality of coronation ceremonies in the classical age events, where the line between divine celebration and deadly conspiracy was often terrifyingly thin. We're about to journey back to a time when a crown wasn't just a symbol of authority. It could be a target on your back, an invitation to conspiracies, and a gamble with fate itself. These ceremonies were so much more than ritual and spectacle. They were masterfully orchestrated political dramas where power, religion, military might, and raw human ambition converged and frequently exploded. Imagine the pressure: one misstep during the sacred anointing, one poorly received speech, or one suspicious glance exchanged between generals, and a coronation meant to solidify an empire could instead trigger its collapse. Rulers understood that their legitimacy and often their survival hinged on these public performances. They had to appear divinely chosen yet approachable, mighty yet merciful, in control yet generous. And all of this unfolded under the gaze of allies and enemies who were waiting, sometimes hoping for a mistake. What we'll uncover together in this video is how these high-stakes rituals didn't just make history, they shaped the destinies of civilizations. From the cunning political maneuvers of Augustus in Rome to the opulent and treacherous coronations of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, we'll see how ancient leaders used every tool available: religion, propaganda, economic influence, and sheer theatricality to secure their rule. And we'll discover that the deadly politics of classical coronations are not just relics of the past. Their echoes can be heard in modern inaugurations, leadership transitions, and the timeless dance between power and vulnerability. So settle in, you're about to step into a world where a crown could mean everything or nothing at all. Now let's step into that scene more closely. Picture the new emperor standing atop the rostra in the Roman Forum, the heavy, gold-encrusted robe of state weighing upon his shoulders. Below him, a sea of faces: senators in their white togas with expressions carefully schooled between respect and ambition, common citizens cheering for the promise of games and grain, and just beyond, the stoic ranks of the Praetorian Guard, their loyalty literally purchased hours before. The air smells of incense from the nearby temples and the faint metallic scent of fear. This was not a simple party. From the earliest days of city-states and empires, the act of making a ruler was the most dangerous and delicate operation a society could perform. It began not with intricate ritual, but with raw power. In the rough and tumble world of early Rome or the fractious Greek city-states, a leader might simply be acclaimed by his warriors or his political faction, a shout of support that could be as easily withdrawn as it was given. This was legitimacy born from immediate strength, but it was fragile. Over centuries, this raw acclamation needed to be sanctified, to be made to feel inevitable and eternal. This is where religion and theater merged into the ceremony we recognize. The simple cheer of soldiers evolved into a meticulously staged performance involving augurs reading the flight of birds to ensure divine favor, high priests anointing the ruler with sacred oils, and the leader himself taking solemn oaths to uphold the laws and traditions of the people. Every gesture, every symbol was a piece of political communication. The crown itself was more than jewelry, it was a contract. In accepting it, the ruler pledged to protect the state, and in bestowing it, the priestly and aristocratic classes signaled their conditional support. But this evolution from acclamation to elaborate ritual didn't remove the danger, it simply raised the stakes. Now, an opponent wasn't just challenging a man, they were challenging a system, a god, and a tradition. This made rebellion harder, but it also made success for a rebel far more devastating. A failed coronation could shatter the illusion of stability and plunge a region into civil war, as rival claimants vied to have their own ceremonies recognized as the legitimate one. The coronation was the keystone in the arch of power. Remove it, and the entire structure could come tumbling down. Now, imagine the scent of burning incense and the low chant of priests filling a grand temple. The new ruler kneels, head bowed, as a high priest anoints his brow with sacred oil, invoking the names of Zeus or Jupiter to bless his reign. In that moment, politics and faith weren't just connected, they were fused into a single, unbreakable bond. This was the heart of the coronation ceremony, where divine favor was the ultimate source of legitimacy, a force so powerful it could make an ordinary man seem untouchable. But this spiritual armor had a critical weakness. To claim the gods were on your side was to invite every rival, every skeptic, and every ambitious general to prove otherwise. Roman emperors, as historian Mary Beard has often highlighted, were masters of this divine theater. They held the title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the state religion, merging political and religious authority into one overwhelming package. Their public ceremonies were meticulously designed to project an image of invincibility and divine sanction. Every sacrifice that yielded favorable omens, every temple vow fulfilled, was publicized as proof that the gods themselves endorsed their rule. But this made the religious ritual itself a point of extreme vulnerability. A rival could easily bribe a priest to report bad omens during a crucial ceremony. A bolt of lightning or an unexpected storm on coronation day could be spun by enemies as a clear sign of the god's displeasure, turning public opinion against a new ruler before he had even finished his first speech. The very rituals meant to project strength could be hijacked to create devastating weakness. Perhaps no one understood this divine balancing act better than Alexander the Great. During his campaign in Egypt, he visited the Oracle of Siwa, where the priests, whether through genuine belief or shrewd political calculation, greeted him as the son of the god Zeus Ammon. Alexander seized upon this, weaving it into the fabric of his coronation and his very identity. Coins were minted showing him with the ram's horns of the deity, and sacrifices were staged to reinforce this celestial lineage. This divine status helped him command loyalty from the diverse and often fractious peoples of his vast empire. However, this same claim also infuriated his Macedonian generals, who saw themselves as his equals, men who had fought beside him for years. They bristled at the idea of kneeling before a man who now claimed to be more than a man. This religious propaganda, intended to unify, instead sowed the seeds of conspiracy and betrayal among his closest companions, proving that a claim of divinity could be just as dangerous as it was powerful. This elevated the entire coronation from a mere political event to a matter of cosmic consequence. A stumble during the sacred procession, a mispronounced prayer, or an unfavorable omen wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a crack in the very foundation of a ruler's legitimacy. The populace watched these signs with a superstitious intensity that modern audiences might find difficult to grasp. Their world was one where the divine was intimately involved in human affairs, and a leader's ability to navigate that relationship was the ultimate test of their fitness to rule. In this high-stakes game, the priests, the augurs, and the oracle mongers were not mere supporting actors. They were power brokers holding the keys to legitimacy in their interpretations of the will of the gods. The coronation was the ultimate test, a performance where the audience included both the mortal and the divine, and a poor review from either could be fatal. Now shift the scene from the solemnity of the temple to the opulent, torch-lit great hall of a royal palace. The formal ceremony is over, and the coronation feast has begun. Long tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and amphorae of fine wine. Laughter and music fill the air, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere is thick with a tension you could cut with a knife or a concealed dagger. Here, amidst the clinking of goblets and the exchange of toasts, the real political work of the coronation unfolded. This was the stage where alliances were forged with one hand while the other hand might be resting on a weapon. Every smile exchanged between a new king and a powerful noble was a carefully calculated gesture, every toast a potential promise or a veiled threat. In this world, the most dangerous person in the room was often the one offering the warmest congratulations. Coronation feasts were not merely celebrations. They were high-stakes diplomatic summits and political marketplaces rolled into one. A new ruler, however powerful, rarely governed alone. Their survival depended on a network of powerful supporters, military generals, wealthy aristocrats, and influential priests. The feast was the prime opportunity to secure their loyalty, often through extravagant gifts, lavish promises of land or titles, or strategic marriage alliances that bound powerful families to the new regime. An oath of fealty sworn over a shared cup of wine in front of hundreds of witnesses was a powerful bond, but it was also a very public one. To break it later would be a profound act of dishonor, which meant these oaths were both a source of strength and a potential catalyst for future resentment if those promises went unfulfilled. Yet, for every alliance solidified over a cup of wine, the feast presented an equally potent opportunity for betrayal. The very gathering of all a kingdom's most powerful and ambitious individuals in one room, many with their own private guards, created a perfect environment for conspiracy. Disgruntled factions, sidelined relatives, or foreign ambassadors with their own agendas could use the chaos and merriment as cover for whispered plots. The ancient historian Plutarch saw right through these pageants, noting that in the courts of kings, trust was a commodity rarer than gold. The nobleman clapping the loudest for the new pharaoh might be the very one plotting with a rival claimant to the throne. The advisor offering a heartfelt toast could be the person who had already poisoned the royal cup. This pervasive paranoia was not unfounded. It was a rational response to a deadly political environment. A chilling example of this familial betrayal erupted around the coronation of Ptolemy IV of Egypt. His ascent to the throne should have been a moment of dynastic consolidation, but instead, it immediately triggered a bloody purge. Fearing that his own mother, Berenice II, and his uncle held too much influence and might oppose him, Ptolemy Roman IV allegedly had them murdered, along with other prominent courtiers and his own brother, to secure his power. His own coronation feast, or its immediate aftermath, likely became the backdrop for these brutal acts. This wasn't an isolated incident but a grim feature of Hellenistic politics, where the palace was often a gilded cage and family members were the most dangerous rivals, their claims to the throne being just as valid as your own. The coronation, intended to project unity and strength, could instead expose the fatal fractures within a ruling house. The tactics used to prevent such betrayals were as complex as the plots themselves. A new ruler had to perform a delicate balancing act. Distributing vast wealth and prestigious titles could buy loyalty, but if done too generously, it could be perceived as weakness or desperation, encouraging even more avarice and ambition. Conversely, ruling with an iron fist and displaying open suspicion could alienate potential allies and push them into the arms of conspirators. It was a game of psychological manipulation as much as it was of material reward. The goal was to make supporting the current regime seem far more profitable and far less risky than opposing it. This required an intricate understanding of human ambition and fear, turning the Coronation Feast into a grand theater where the new monarch played the lead role of both generous benefactor and unassailable power. While the daggers hidden beneath cloaks may have been replaced by sharp political maneuvering and corporate backstabbing, these ancient dynamics feel eerily familiar in modern boardrooms or political conventions where new leaders take charge, promising a new era while nervously watching the smiles of their supposed allies. But the most crucial military audience was often the one closest to home, the elite units tasked with protecting the emperor himself. In Rome, no coronation could proceed without the explicit and often purchased blessing of the Praetorian Guard. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were the emperor's personal protectors, stationed within the city walls, better paid, and wielding immense political power. Their endorsement was the final, non-negotiable step in any imperial accession. A new emperor who failed to secure their loyalty with a substantial cash payment, known as a donativum, was essentially a king on a chessboard without any pawns completely exposed. The tragic case of Pertinax serves as a stark warning. A respected senator, he was proclaimed emperor after the assassination of Commodus in the year 193. He tried to institute much-needed fiscal reforms and austerity, but in doing so, he notoriously refused to pay the Praetorian Guard the extravagant donativum they expected. His reign lasted a mere 86 days. The Guard, feeling cheated and disrespected, simply broke into the palace and murdered him, then infamously auctioned off the imperial throne to the highest bidder, Didius Julius. This extreme example shows that a coronation spectacle was not just about displaying power to the outside world, it was also an internal transaction. The military's loyalty was not given freely. It was contingent on the ruler's ability and willingness to continuously reward and recognize their crucial role. A coronation was the first and most important installment on that ongoing debt. These parades were therefore a breathtakingly delicate performance of mutual dependence. The legions marched to show their unity and strength behind the new leader, projecting an image of unshakable solidarity to deter any would-be challengers. In return, the new ruler, by reviewing the troops, distributing awards, and promising future bonuses, was publicly acknowledging that his power rested on their shoulders. It was a carefully choreographed dance of reciprocity. Historians note that every element, from the order of the march to the specific units chosen to lead, was a deliberate political message. A general who had recently won a great victory might be given a place of honor to flatter him and keep him content, while the units of a potential rival might be positioned further back, a subtle signal of their diminished status. The spectacle was meant to project an image of seamless control, but it also created a moment of immense vulnerability. What if the troops, instead of cheering, remained silent? What if a disgruntled commander had already spread dissent among the ranks? The entire event could turn from a celebration of power into a public humiliation, or worse, the spark for an immediate mutiny. The very act of gathering the military strength in one place, intended to intimidate enemies, also concentrated potential opposition, making the coronation one of the most dangerous days of a ruler's life. This ancient dynamic, where the military is both the ultimate guarantor of a leader's authority and its greatest potential threat, is not confined to the dust of history. We see its echoes in the modern world. From the careful choreography of military reviews during state inaugurations to the tense relationship between civilian governments and powerful military establishments in various nations. The fundamental question remains: who truly holds the power? Is it the ruler who commands the army, or the army that permits the ruler to command? The coronation spectacles of the classical age put this tension on full, glorious, and terrifying display. They were a breathtaking gamble, a public demonstration that the new leader had successfully harnessed the most formidable force in the state. But as we will see next, for every ruler who managed to secure the loyalty of their soldiers, there were others who discovered that the greatest dangers were not waiting on distant battlefields, but were standing right beside them in the coronation procession, smiling, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. And so, the very spectacle designed to project an image of unassailable power, the cheering crowds, the solemn religious rites, the grand military display, created the perfect conditions for its opposite, the assassin's blade. If the coronation was the ultimate performance of strength, it was also the moment of maximum vulnerability, a paradox that many rulers did not survive. The most famous example, though not a coronation itself, perfectly captures this lethal dynamic: the assassination of Julius Caesar. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, Caesar was murdered in the theater of Pompey, a very public space, by a group of senators that included his close allies and even, according to some accounts, a man he considered like a son. They used the cover of a crowded public ceremony to get close to him, and they struck him down at the foot of a statue of his rival, a moment of breathtakingly public betrayal that laid bare the fragility of power. The lesson was clear: no amount of personal glory could protect you from the daggers of those you trusted most. This was a lesson tragically learned by Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. In the year 336 BC, Philip had organized an extravagant festival in the theater at Igi to celebrate the wedding of his daughter. More importantly, it was a carefully staged prelude to his own coronation as the leader of a pan-Hellenic alliance against Persia. The entire Greek world was watching. As the grand procession began, Philip entered the theater, basking in the acclaim, his guards deliberately kept at a distance to emphasize his confidence and connection to the people. In that exact moment, a young nobleman named Pausanias rushed forward and stabbed him to death. The assassin did not emerge from the shadows of a back alley. He struck in front of thousands of witnesses, using the spectacle itself as his weapon. The coronation-turned-funeral proved that the most dangerous threats were not foreign armies, but the intimate enemies nurtured within one's own court. Historians point out that these plots almost always originated from a ruler's inner circle. The very people who had the most to gain from a stable reign, advisors, generals, and family members, were also the ones with the greatest access and often the most burning grievances. Motivations were a toxic cocktail of personal slights, thwarted ambition, and ideological fervor. A trusted general passed over for a promotion, a financial minister whose embezzlement was discovered, a brother or son impatient for their inheritance. Any of these could become the architect of a regicide. The methods were as varied as the motives. While the concealed dagger was a classic tool, the paranoid imagination of the ancient world dreamed up far more insidious methods. There were rumors of crowns lined with poisoned spikes that would slowly seep toxin into the wearer's brow, or of ceremonial robes treated with lethal substances. Perhaps the most common fear was poison in the celebratory feast, a sip of wine from a specially prepared cup, a delicacy tainted with a deadly herb. This pervasive threat gave rise to elaborate countermeasures. Roman emperors employed food tasters, known as pregustators, to sample every dish and drink before it reached their lips. bodyguards were a constant presence, yet as Philip II's death shows, they could be strategically held back at the most crucial moment to maintain the illusion of a ruler's fearless accessibility. This constant, gnawing fear of betrayal fundamentally shaped the psychology and behavior of classical leaders. It forced them to live in a state of perpetual calculation, constantly balancing the need to be visible and accessible to their people with the absolute necessity of security. Could they afford to walk freely through the crowd? Should they eat the food offered by a seemingly loyal subject? Every public appearance, especially the coronation, was a risk assessment. This paranoia could be a survival tool, but it could also curdle into the very tyranny that inspired plots in the first place. A ruler who trusted no one might purge his court of capable advisors, surround himself with sycophants, and become isolated from the reality of his realm, actions that only made him more vulnerable in the long run. The coronation ceremony, therefore, was not just a single dangerous day. It was a microcosm of the endless tightrope walk of leadership, where trust was the most valuable and most perilous commodity of all. But these potent symbols were never just inert pieces of metal and cloth. They were active tools in a high-stakes information war, a form of propaganda designed to broadcast a very specific message to every citizen, from the highest senator to the lowliest street vendor. Consider the simple yet profound act of placing a crown upon a ruler's head. In the hands of a master propagandist like Alexander the Great, this object was transformed into a revolutionary statement. His adoption of the Persian diadem, a simple white ribbon head band, was a deliberate and shocking act. To his Macedonian soldiers, it was a symbol of the Eastern despotism they had fought to overthrow, a betrayal of their Greek ideals. But to the vast, conquered populations of Persia, it was a powerful signal of respect and inclusion. Alexander wasn't just wearing a crown, he was visually communicating his grand vision of a fused Greco-Persian empire, where cultural lines blurred under his sole authority. This single piece of fabric was so loaded with meaning that it simultaneously consolidated his power over new subjects and dangerously alienated his oldest companions, proving that the most effective propaganda could also be the most divisive. The Romans, particularly Augustus, elevated this symbolic language to an art form. After the brutal civil wars that ended the Republic, Augustus faced a monumental task. He had to consolidate absolute power while maintaining the illusion that he was restoring the very republic he had effectively dismantled. His genius lay in his manipulation of coronation symbols. He refused the title of king or the overt crown of a Hellenistic monarch, which would have been toxic to Roman sensibilities. Instead, he embraced and redefined other symbols. He was granted the civic crown of oak leaves, awarded for saving the lives of Roman citizens, a constant visual reminder that he was the nation's savior, not its dictator. His image was consistently portrayed as youthful, vigorous, and serene, often wearing the corona civica, projecting an aura of stable, benevolent, and eternal leadership. Every statue, every coin minted with his profile, every public appearance was a carefully staged ritual reinforcing the narrative of peace, prosperity, and continuity. He wasn't just holding power, he was performing it, using a universally understood visual language to assure a traumatized people that the chaos was over. Yet for every symbol created to enforce loyalty, there was a counter-symbol waiting to challenge it. Rivals and detractors understood the power of this visual rhetoric and quickly learned to subvert it. If an emperor like Augustus used the civic crown to represent salvation, his enemies might mock it as a hollow prop, a theatrical gesture hiding his tyrannical ambitions. During times of civil war, rival claimants to the throne would immediately have their own coins struck, their own statues erected, and their own ceremonial regalia produced. By doing so, they weren't just claiming the throne, they were creating an alternative visual reality for their supporters, a competing narrative of legitimacy. A general proclaimed emperor by his troops on a distant frontier would immediately cloak himself in purple, even if it was just a dyed blanket, understanding that the symbol itself had the power to conjure the authority it represented. This created a fascinating paradox. The more standardized and powerful a symbol became, the more vulnerable it was to being stolen, mimicked, or corrupted by those seeking to break the monopoly on power. This ancient struggle over symbols forces us to look at our modern world with fresh eyes. When a president is inaugurated on the steps of the Capitol, placing a hand on a Bible and taking a solemn oath, how different is it, in essence, from a Roman emperor swearing to uphold the laws of the Republic? The military parades, the specific wardrobe choices, the carefully curated backdrops of flags and eagles, these are all part of a centuries-old playbook designed to project stability, tradition, and legitimacy. We might not have golden crowns, but the tailored suits, the presidential seals, and the staged handshakes serve the same fundamental purpose: to communicate a narrative of control and authority directly to the masses, bypassing rational argument and appealing to deeper, almost primal, instincts about leadership and order. The question is not whether these symbols still hold power, but whether we, as a modern audience, are any more critically aware of their manipulative potential than the citizens of Rome were 2,000 years ago. We are still living in a world shaped by the symbolic language of ancient coronations, where perception is often just as important as reality. Behind every grand procession, every gilded crown, and every public feast lay a stark economic reality. Coronations were phenomenally expensive undertakings, and who paid for them and who benefited was a matter of life and death. While the crowds marveled at the spectacle, the political and merchant elites saw a high-stakes economic transaction unfolding. The control of a kingdom's treasury, its fertile lands, and its lucrative trade routes wasn't just decided in the coronation's aftermath. It was often the very currency used to make the ceremony happen in the first place. A new ruler's ability to fund their own ascension was the first real test of their economic power, a test that could either cement their authority or plant the seeds of their eventual downfall. The funding sources for these events read like a map of imperial ambition and extraction. War booty seized from conquered nations was a favorite and highly visible method. Pouring the plundered wealth of Gaul or Persia into a Roman triumphal procession or a coronation feast demonstrated the new emperor's prowess as a victorious general and his ability to enrich the state. Taxes and tribute from subject provinces were another enormous source, but this was a far more delicate tool. A coronation funded by heavy taxation could be portrayed by rivals as a leader squeezing the people to pay for their own glorification, a potent piece of propaganda that could ignite rebellion in far-off territories. Then there was the state's own stored wealth, the vast reserves of gold, silver, and grain accumulated by previous rulers. Tapping into these reserves was a powerful statement of continuity, but it also risked depleting the strategic cushion that protected the realm from famine or future wars. The lavishness of the ceremony was a carefully calibrated signal. Too modest, and the new ruler might be perceived as weak or lacking divine favor. Too extravagant, and they could be seen as wasteful, out of touch, and dangerously draining the state's lifeblood for a single day's pageantry. Perhaps no classical ruler understood the power of economic statecraft better than Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Her coronation and the consolidation of her power were masterclasses in leveraging economic assets. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, its vast grain harvests a source of immense wealth and strategic power. Cleopatra used this resource brilliantly. She could promise shiploads of grain to secure the loyalty of key Roman factions, most notably first Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. This wasn't just a gift, it was a calculated investment in her own political survival, making powerful Roman leaders economically dependent on her continued rule. However, this very strategy also made her a target. Other Romans, like the fiercely republican Cicero, saw her not as an allied queen but as a dangerous foreign influence who was using Egypt's economic might to corrupt the Roman Republic and buy the loyalty of its generals. Her wealth became a double-edged sword, simultaneously securing her throne and painting a target on her back for those who believed the destiny of Rome should not be for sale to a Hellenistic monarch. The coronation itself was a pivotal moment for the redistribution of wealth, a grand reordering of the economic hierarchy that could make or break a reign. To secure the loyalty of the powerful, a new ruler had to be generous to a fault. Vast tracts of land were gifted to supportive generals. Lucrative tax collection contracts were granted to allied merchants. The most powerful tool of all was the widespread cancellation of debts, a practice known as a clean slate decree. For the common person buried under crushing personal debt, this could make the new ruler a literal savior, guaranteeing immense popular support. But for the wealthy creditors, often the very aristocrats and bankers who had financed the coronation, it could be a catastrophic financial loss, turning staunch allies into bitter, vengeful enemies. This created an impossible balancing act. As one economic historian noted, the coronation was a vortex that sucked wealth from the periphery of the empire and the lower classes and concentrated it in the hands of the new regime's inner circle. It stabilized the center by destabilizing the margins, a dangerous game that often stored up trouble for the future. This system of rewards created a fascinating and often corrupt symbiosis between the palace and the marketplace. The immense upfront cost of a coronation, paying the army, funding the games, constructing temporary monuments, feasting the entire city, was often far beyond the immediate cash reserves of the state. This is where merchants and bankers entered the political arena. A wealthy silk importer or a powerful grain shipping magnate could loan the vast sums needed, effectively bankrolling the new regime. In return, they didn't just expect their money back with interest, they sought political favors that would generate far greater wealth. They might be granted a monopoly on a certain trade, an exclusive contract to supply the army, or precious immunity from certain taxes. The coronation, therefore, wasn't just a change of political leadership. It was a hostile takeover that reshaped the entire economic landscape, creating a new class of ultra-privileged cronies while leaving previous business elites out in the cold and seething with resentment. When we look at these ancient economic battles, the parallels to our modern world are both striking and sobering. The coronation of a classical ruler and the inauguration of a modern leader both serve as moments where vast sums of money change hands, where lucrative government contracts are promised to supporters, and where the relationship between private wealth and public power is put on full display. The fear of a leader being bought by special interests, the public resentment over the extravagant cost of a ceremony during a time of economic hardship, the tension between funding public works and funding political spectacle, these are not new dilemmas. They are ancient, recurring patterns rooted in the fundamental connection between money and power. The deadly politics of coronations were, in many ways, a brutal preview of the economic pressures that still define and destabilize leadership transitions today, proving that while the crowns may be gone, the high cost of power remains. While the Romans perfected the art of the military-political coronation and the Greeks viewed it as a public competition, if we journey east to the vast Persian Empire, we find a ceremony built upon an entirely different cultural foundation. Here, the coronation was not merely about political legitimacy or military acclaim. It was a sacred covenant between the king, his people, and the divine forces of the universe. The centerpiece of the Persian ritual was the sacred fire, an eternal flame representing the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda's divine wisdom and the cosmic order, or Shah. The new Shahanshah, the King of Kings, would be anointed in the presence of this fire, a powerful declaration that his rule was not just approved by the gods, but was essential to maintaining harmony and justice on earth. This transformed the Persian monarch into more than a political leader. He was a warrior shepherd, a divinely appointed guardian tasked with protecting his flock from chaos, lies, and external enemies. This profound spiritual responsibility created a unique political vulnerability. A Persian king's legitimacy was inextricably linked to his perceived piety and his ability to uphold this cosmic order. A military defeat or a natural disaster like a drought could be interpreted not as a simple misfortune, but as a catastrophic sign that the king had lost the favor of Ahura Mazda, instantly shattering his authority and inviting challengers to restore the divine balance. This model of inclusive coronation politics reached its zenith with Cyrus the Great. After conquering the mighty Babylonian Empire, Cyrus faced the immense challenge of ruling a vast, multicultural realm of Medes, Persians, Babylonians, Jews, and many others. His genius was reflected in his coronation. He didn't impose a purely Persian ceremony on his new subjects. Instead, he brilliantly blended traditions. He likely underwent the Zoroastrian rites of the Persian heartland, but he also participated in the ancient Akitu festival in Babylon, a Mesopotamian New Year ceremony where the king would humble himself before the statue of the god Marduk to reaffirm his sacred duty. Furthermore, his famous cylinder, often called the First Charter of Human Rights, proclaimed his respect for the local customs and religions of all the peoples he ruled. He even ordered the return of Jewish exiles to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of their temple. This was a masterstroke of coronation propaganda. By embracing the rituals of the conquered, Cyrus wasn't weakening his power. He was building a broader, more resilient base of legitimacy. He became a legitimate ruler in the eyes of each culture according to their own traditions. However, this strategy of inclusivity also came with its own set of dangers. It required a delicate, continuous balancing act. Powerful priestly classes from different regions, each feeling their ritual had granted the king his throne, could make competing demands. Keeping all these diverse constituencies happy required immense political skill and resources, turning the coronation not into a single moment of unity, but into the opening move of a never-ending campaign to manage a sprawling, multicultural empire. Contrast this with the world of the Egyptian pharaohs, where coronation was less a political event and more a cosmological necessity. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the divine link between the gods and humanity. His coronation was therefore a critical moment of religious renewal for the entire kingdom, intricately tied to the life-giving cycle of the Nile. The ceremony, held at the Temple of Ptah in Memphis, involved a series of rituals so sacred that their exact details remain shrouded in mystery. We know it involved running a ritual course to symbolize the territorial unity of Egypt, being presented to the statues of the gods, and receiving the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, the Pishent, as well as the crook and flail, symbols of his role as the shepherd and nourisher of his people. This deep intertwining of the pharaoh's identity with the divine and the natural world made religious dissent the ultimate threat. A challenge to the pharaoh was not mere treason. It was an act of impiety that threatened to destabilize Maat, the fundamental order of the universe, and could, in the eyes of the people, bring about famine, plague, or the Nile failing to flood. This meant the most dangerous rivals were often not generals but high priests and temple officials. A powerful priestly caste controlling vast estates and the religious narrative could subtly undermine a pharaoh by questioning his piety, manipulating omens, or even withholding their crucial ceremonial endorsement. The political battle in Egypt was fought not on the battlefield but in the dimly lit halls of temples, where control over ritual translated directly into control over the kingdom. This panoramic view of classical coronations reveals a fascinating truth. The specific cultural flavor of a ceremony directly dictated its unique political risks. A Roman emperor had to constantly look over his shoulder at his Praetorian guard. A Persian king had to fear a bad harvest being seen as divine displeasure, and an Egyptian pharaoh had to worry most about the whispers of his high priests. The ritual itself was a lens that focused specific cultural pressures onto the ruler. This forces us to ask a profound question that echoes into our modern era. In an increasingly globalized world, how do leaders balance cultural inclusivity with the need for a stable, unified identity? Can a modern political ceremony, like an inauguration, successfully incorporate diverse traditions to build broader legitimacy, as Cyrus did? Or does this risk creating a diluted narrative that fails to resonate deeply with any single group, potentially fostering fragmentation rather than unity? The ancient world suggests that the most successful rulers were those who understood their unique cultural landscape and crafted a coronation that spoke directly to it, while deftly managing the specific dangers that landscape presented. Their triumphs and failures provide a timeless lesson in the delicate art of turning ceremony into power and the deadly price of getting it wrong. Now, let's turn our attention to one of history's most brilliant and calculated political performances, the rise of Augustus. Picture Rome in the year 27 BC, a city still trembling from decades of civil war, proscriptions, and the shock of Julius Caesar's assassination. The Republic was a ghost, but its memory was a powerful force. Into this volatile landscape stepped a young man named Gaius Octavius, who would become Augustus. His challenge was not to seize power outright. That was the crude method of a dictator, and he had seen how that ended for his adopted father. His genius was in staging a coronation without ever calling it one, crafting a masterpiece of political theater that disguised absolute power as humble service. He understood the Roman allergy to the word king, so he never took the title. Instead, in a carefully orchestrated performance before the Senate, he famously restored the Republic, handing back the powers he had held during the civil wars. It was a breathtaking act of political judo. The Senate, grateful and perhaps terrified, immediately granted him a new package of authority. They gave him the name Augustus, a deeply religious term meaning the revered one, and awarded him ultimate military command, or imperium, over the crucial frontier provinces. This was the real genius. He didn't wear a crown, he held proconsular imperium. He wasn't a monarch, he was princeps, the first among equals in the Senate. The historian Suetonius captures this delicate dance, noting how Augustus avoided any outward show of monarchy, even having the doors of his house modestly decorated, while simultaneously controlling every lever of the state. His coronation was not a single event, but a series of these calculated gestures: the acceptance of the name Augustus, the receiving of a golden shield honoring his virtues, the gradual accumulation of priestly offices, that together wove an unassailable cloak of authority. But this masterful branding exercise was backed by ruthless realpolitik and the constant, chilling awareness of mortal danger. Augustus had risen to power over the corpses of his rivals, most notably Mark Antony and Cleopatra, whom he defeated at the Battle of Actium. His propaganda machine worked tirelessly to paint Antony as a decadent Eastern puppet, enslaved by a foreign queen, while Augustus was the pious defender of traditional Roman values. This was more than just smear campaign. It was a crucial part of legitimizing his rule by framing his opponents as enemies of the state itself. Yet, even after his victory, the threats did not cease. Republican sentiment still simmered beneath the surface of Roman aristocracy. There were multiple plots on his life, conspiracies led by men who saw through the facade and yearned for the old ways. In response, Augustus, ever the pragmatist, became a master of security. He created the Praetorian Guard, his elite personal army, and maintained a vast network of informants to sniff out disloyalty before it could erupt into violence. His reign was a paradox. He presented an image of peace and restoration, the Pax Augusta, while governing a state that was, in practice, a police state where dissent could be lethal. A key element of his strategy was the clever, almost cynical, use of the Senate in his ceremonies. He understood that to strip the old aristocracy of all its dignity would be to create a class of bitter, desperate enemies. So he gave them a role. In his public appearances and rituals, senators were prominently featured. They passed the resolutions that granted him his powers. They walked in his processions. They held high priesthoods and governorships, though always under his watchful eye. This created a brilliant illusion of shared power, a facade that allowed the senatorial class to save face and maintain a sense of participation. They were actors in his play, and he was the director and lead performer. This balancing act became the model for future emperors, but it also set a dangerous precedent. It established that power ultimately flowed not from the Senate and the people of Rome, but from the military and the personal authority of one man. The delicate system Augustus built relied entirely on the character and competence of the emperor. As future generations would discover, not all emperors would be as shrewd, patient, or lucky as Augustus. The very stability he created was a personal achievement, not an institutional one, making the entire imperial system vulnerable to the whims and weaknesses of his successors. When we look at the reign of Augustus, we are essentially watching the invention of political branding. Every move was a calculated signal. His revival of ancient religious ceremonies wasn't just piety, it was a message that he was restoring divine order after a period of chaos. His massive building program, which transformed Rome from a city of brick to a city of marble, was not mere vanity. It was physical propaganda, a permanent stone and mortar testament to his power, generosity, and the new golden age he claimed to have ushered in. The risks he navigated are strikingly familiar today. The centralization of power, the use of media and spectacle to shape public perception, the careful management of elite factions, and the constant tension between security and liberty, these are not ancient relics. They are the enduring challenges of leadership. Augustus's story shows us that the most effective power is often the power that disguises itself, that the most stable throne is sometimes the one that doesn't look like a throne at all. His coronation by another name offers a timeless lesson. In politics, perception is not just reality, it is the ultimate form of control. Now, let's sail across the Mediterranean to the glittering, sun-baked coast of Alexandria, where the politics of coronation took on a uniquely toxic and familial flavor. If the Roman world was a knife fight in a forum, the Hellenistic kingdoms carved from the fragments of Alexander the Great's empire were a gilded cage where the most dangerous predators were your own kin. Here, in the opulent palace overlooking the great lighthouse, coronations were less about divine sanction and far more about raw, dynastic survival, a brutal game of thrones where the crown was often passed not by inheritance, but through a haze of poison and betrayal. The Ptolemaic court of Egypt was the epicenter of this intrigue. Imagine a coronation here, not a singular event for a solitary ruler, but a complex, multi-layered ceremony designed to accommodate a bewildering array of co-rulers. It was common for a pharaoh to be crowned alongside their mother, their spouse, their sibling, or even their own child. This wasn't a gesture of family unity. It was a precarious power-sharing agreement, a way to balance the competing ambitions of a ruling clan where everyone had a plausible claim to the throne. The air during these ceremonies was thick with forced smiles and unspoken threats. A queen mother being crowned with her son was not just a proud parent, she was a political player ensuring her faction retained influence. A brother and sister, often married to each other to keep the bloodline pure, would be anointed together, their eyes locked in a partnership that was as much about mutual suspicion as it was about shared rule. This created an atmosphere of perpetual tension, where the coronation itself was merely the opening move in the next round of intra-family warfare. The most infamous example of this lethal domesticity is the shocking story of Ptolemy XI. His reign was spectacularly brief, lasting only a few days in the year 80 BC. He was forced by the powerful Roman dictator Sulla to marry his stepmother, Berenice III, and rule jointly with her. She was a popular figure with the people of Alexandria, while he was an unknown, arrogant newcomer. Almost immediately, tensions exploded. Rather than share power, Ptolemy XI, in a fit of brutal impatience, simply had his new wife and co-ruler murdered. This act of breathtaking political stupidity and violence so enraged the citizenry of Alexandria that they stormed the palace and lynched him in the very gymnasium where he had taken refuge. His coronation robes likely still fresh, he became a gruesome lesson in how the complex co-rulership of the Hellenistic world could combust with horrific speed, turning the palace from a seat of power into a slaughterhouse. To understand why these ceremonies were so volatile, we need to look at their unique cultural recipe. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks ruling over an ancient Egyptian population. Their coronations were therefore masterpieces of blended propaganda, designed to appeal to both groups. In the same ceremony, a ruler would be crowned in the Greek style, perhaps with a simple diadem, and then travel to Memphis to be invested as a traditional Egyptian pharaoh, receiving the P-Shent crown and undergoing the sacred rituals of the native priesthood. This cultural fusion was a brilliant strategy for building a broad base of legitimacy, but it also built a house on a fault line. It created distinct power bases that rival family members could exploit. One claimant might rally the support of the wealthy Greek elite and the army, while another could court the influential Egyptian priestly class, who controlled vast tracts of land and the hearts of the common people. A coronation meant to unify could instead highlight the deep ethnic and cultural divisions within the kingdom, giving every faction a champion within the royal family itself. And waiting in the wings always was the emerging superpower of Rome, watching this dynastic chaos with the keen interest of a vulture circling wounded prey. Roman senators saw the Hellenistic kingdoms not as sovereign nations, but as client states and potential provinces. The constant family strife presented them with the perfect opportunity to meddle. A disgruntled prince or princess could easily flee to Rome, where they would be welcomed as a guest, trained, funded, and then backed as a puppet claimant when the time was right. The Roman Senate would often act as the arbiter of succession disputes, their legions the ultimate enforcement mechanism for their decision. This external manipulation took the already deadly game of Hellenistic coronation politics and poured gasoline on it. It incentivized betrayal within the family, as a rival knew they could get powerful foreign backing, and it raised the stakes of every power struggle from a domestic affair to an international crisis. A coronation was no longer just about which sibling would win. It was about which one would become the obedient client of Rome. a decision that could determine the very survival of the kingdom. This ancient interplay of family ambition and foreign interference forces us to look at the modern world with a disquieting sense of recognition. While we may not have many brother-sister monarchs today, the dynamics of dynastic politics are alive and well in various nations across the globe, where political power is concentrated within a single family or a small oligarchy. The same patterns emerge, the public displays of unity masking bitter internal rivalries, the careful cultivation of different power bases within the state, be they military, business, or religious, by different family members, and the ever-present temptation for external powers to pick a side. A modern coronation in such a state, whether it's a formal succession or a political convention, is often a tense moment where these internal and external pressures collide. The question we are left with is a sobering one. Have we truly evolved beyond the treacherous politics of the Ptolemaic court, or have we simply replaced the diadems with business suits and the Roman legions with economic sanctions and covert intelligence operations? The players and the sets may have changed, but the script for this deadly drama remains hauntingly familiar. Amidst the incense and the acclamation, there was another group of spectators whose presence was perhaps the most dangerous of all, the foreign dignitaries. A coronation in the classical age was the ultimate diplomatic stage, a gathering of kings, ambassadors, and envoys from every corner of the known world. To the untrained eye, they were honored guests there to offer gifts and pay respects, but in reality, they were players in a high-stakes game of international intrigue, their smiling faces often masks for cold calculation. The arrival of a Persian satrap at a Greek coronation or a Roman legate at an Egyptian one was not a simple formality. It was a reconnaissance mission, a power play, and a potential conspiracy all rolled into one. These ceremonies were the ancient equivalent of a modern global summit, where the future of alliances, trade routes, and even wars was decided not in secret negotiations, but in the open, under the guise of celebration. The gifts they brought were the opening moves in this diplomatic chess match. A magnificent war elephant from a Seleucid king or a chest of rare silks from an Indian ambassador was never just a gift. It was a carefully calibrated message. It could be a genuine offer of friendship, a subtle display of the giver's immense wealth and power, or even a veiled threat. The Greek historian Polybius, who understood the mechanics of power better than most, observed that in international politics, the kindness of friends is not so sure a guarantee of their goodwill as the fear of enemies. A lavish gift created an obligation, a debt of honor that could be called upon later. Conversely, a gift that was too modest or culturally inappropriate could be taken as a profound insult, instantly turning a potential ally into a sworn enemy before the new ruler had even left the temple. Every present was a form of speech, and every ambassador was a master of this silent, dangerous language. Perhaps no one wielded the coronation as a diplomatic weapon more effectively than Mithridates VI of Pontus. His entire reign was a declaration of war on the expanding Roman Republic, and his coronation was his first and most powerful salvo. He didn't use the event to seek Roman approval. He used it to openly defy them and rally a coalition of all the smaller kingdoms and tribes who feared Roman domination. His court during the festivities would have been a hive of anti-Roman sentiment, where ambassadors from Bithynia, Armenia, and even distant Greek city-states could meet in secret, forging alliances under the very noses of any Roman observers present. Mithridates presented himself not just as a new king, but as a champion of Hellenistic freedom against Italian aggression. This was an incredibly risky strategy. It was a direct provocation, practically guaranteeing a violent Roman response. But for Mithridates, the coronation was the perfect platform to signal his intentions to the wider world and to measure the depth of support he could expect for the coming conflicts. His ceremony was less a celebration and more a call to arms, a brilliant piece of theater that transformed a domestic ritual into an international manifesto. One of the most enduring and perilous tools of diplomacy showcased at these events was the dynastic marriage. To seal an alliance, a new ruler might promise to marry the sibling or child of a visiting foreign king. This was the ultimate political bond, literally tying two royal bloodlines together. A foreign princess arriving with a vast dowry and her own retinue of priests, advisors, and servants could become a powerful figure in her new court, a permanent representative of her homeland's interests. While intended to create peace, these unions often sowed the seeds of future conflict. The foreign spouse, seeking to advance their own family's influence or protect their native kingdom, could become the center of a powerful faction, viewed with deep suspicion by the local nobility. If the king died young, this foreign queen mother, ruling as regent for her infant son, could effectively hand control of the kingdom to her country of origin. The marriage bed, a symbol of unity, could quickly become a breeding ground for resentment, xenophobia, and civil war, proving that the most intimate human relationships were never free from the corrupting touch of high politics. The coronation crowd, therefore, was a minefield of hidden agendas. Amid the cheering citizens and reverent priests, foreign spies moved with ease, their eyes and ears tuned to every detail. They would note which generals received the greatest honors, which aristocratic families seemed displeased, and what the mood of the populace truly was. This intelligence was priceless. It could help a foreign power identify potential dissidents to later bribe or assess the new ruler's military readiness. The very openness of the ceremony, its requirement to display strength and unity, was its greatest vulnerability. It offered a perfect reconnaissance opportunity for any state contemplating an invasion or a rebellion. A rival king watching from the stands wasn't just witnessing a ritual, he was conducting a strategic assessment, looking for any crack in the facade, any sign of weakness he could exploit in the years to come. The coronation was the first and best chance for a foreign power to take the measure of its new neighbor, friend, or foe. When we watch a modern presidential inauguration, with its attending foreign heads of state and rows of diplomatic dignitaries, we are seeing the direct descendant of these ancient practices. The handshakes, the photo opportunities, the private bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the public ceremony, these are all part of the same timeless dance. A newly elected leader must immediately navigate a complex web of international relationships, reassuring allies, warning adversaries, and establishing their place on the world stage. The risks and opportunities are just as profound. A careless comment, a snub perceived or real, or a too warm embrace with a controversial figure can trigger diplomatic incidents or shift global markets. The ancient world understood that the transfer of power is a moment of profound international uncertainty, and the coronation ceremony was the primary tool for managing that uncertainty, for projecting stability, and for defining a new chapter in foreign policy before a single official decree had even been issued. But in the grand theaters of power, the performance didn't end when the crown was placed. It was just beginning its long run through history itself. The accounts of these coronations, the official records carved into stone and written on precious papyrus, were never simple news reports. They were the first draft of a legacy, meticulously edited and often ruthlessly rewritten by the victors to control how the event would be remembered for centuries to come. Imagine a team of imperial scribes and sculptors not as journalists, but as master propagandists, their chisels and pens serving the state, carefully shaping reality to ensure their patron was immortalized not as they were, but as they wished to be seen. This manipulation of memory was a political weapon as powerful as any army, turning the historical record into a contested battleground where truth was the first casualty. The Romans had a terrifyingly frank practice for dealing with failed rulers, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was more than a posthumous insult. It was a systematic, state-sanctioned effort to erase a person from history. When an emperor like Geta, the brother of Caracalla, was murdered and declared an enemy of the state, the order went out. His name was chiseled off public inscriptions. His face was hacked from grand stone reliefs showing the imperial family. His statues were torn down and melted, and every official record of his coronation and reign was hunted down and destroyed. The goal was to create a void, to make it as if he had never existed. Walking through the Roman Forum after such a purge, a citizen would see a gap where a statue once stood, a scarred stone where a name had been carved. This visible absence was a powerful message. To cross the ruling power was to risk not just death, but oblivion. It was a warning to future rivals and a way for the new regime to cleanse the past, creating a seamless narrative of legitimate and virtuous leadership without any embarrassing interruptions. Yet the ancient historians were far from neutral observers themselves. Take Herodotus, the so-called father of history. When he described the lavish coronation rituals of Eastern kings or the customs of foreign peoples, he was often less concerned with factual accuracy and more with crafting a compelling moral story for his Greek audience. His accounts were filled with exaggeration, hearsay, and dramatic speeches he could not possibly have witnessed. He might inflate the number of guests at a Persian coronation feast or emphasize a bad omen that supposedly predicted a king's fall, all to serve a larger theme about the dangers of hubris or the virtues of Greek moderation. This wasn't considered unethical in his time. It was a narrative technique. The lesson was more important than the literal truth. This creates an immense challenge for modern historians who must sift through these biased accounts, cross-referencing the colorful stories of a Herodotus with the drier but more reliable administrative records that sometimes survive on broken pieces of pottery or crumbling papyrus. This is where archaeology becomes a revolutionary tool, acting as a silent whistleblower on the manipulated written record. A prime example is the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut. For years after her death, her stepson Thutmose III attempted to systematically erase her from history, chiseling her name and image from temple walls in a classic case of ancient damnatio memoriae. For centuries, based on the surviving records, she was a forgotten ruler, but archaeologists excavating her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri unearthed a different story. They found statues hidden in pits, deliberately buried to protect them from destruction, and inscriptions that had been overlooked. These physical artifacts testified to a long and prosperous reign, a powerful female pharaoh who had successfully ruled as king. The stones, silent for millennia, spoke the truth that the official history had tried to silence, revealing the gaps and lies in the textual narrative and forcing a complete rewrite of Egyptian history. Rulers understood that controlling their legacy started on day one, and they employed armies of artists and poets to ensure the right story was told. A court poet like Virgil, writing his masterpiece the Aeneid, was effectively crafting the divine origin story for Augustus's regime, linking his rule to the heroic Trojan prince Aeneas and the goddess Venus. A royal sculptor was not capturing a likeness but an ideal, creating statues of the emperor that portrayed him as eternally youthful, vigorous, and wise, regardless of his actual age or health. These artists were architects of perception, building an immortal image of a coronation that was always glorious, always divinely sanctioned, and always welcomed by a grateful populace. The messy, violent, or chaotic reality was smoothed over, polished into a flawless gem of propaganda designed to convince both contemporary subjects and future generations of the inevitability and righteousness of the ruler's power. This ancient struggle over narrative forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question about our own time. When we watch the wall-to-wall media coverage of a modern presidential inauguration or a royal wedding, are we seeing the event itself, or are we seeing a curated, packaged version designed to shape public perception? The players have changed. Instead of court poets, we have spin doctors and communications directors. Instead of imperial sculptors, we have photo editors and social media managers, but the game remains remarkably familiar. The careful control of the camera angles, the selection of which moments to broadcast and which to ignore, the crafting of the perfect soundbite, these are all modern tools for achieving the same ancient goal: constructing a legacy in real time. It begs us to be critical consumers of history, both ancient and modern, to always look for the gaps in the record, to question the official story, and to remember that the version of events that survives is often the one that the most powerful people wanted us to see. This relentless pressure to control the narrative, to forever manage how one is perceived, leads us directly into the mind of the ruler themselves, a place where the weight of this manufactured reality created a psychological burden that was often too heavy to bear. Imagine the weight of knowing that every smiling face in the crowd at your coronation could be hiding a dagger, that every toast from a trusted general might be a lie, and that the very divine favor you claimed could be used against you with a single bad omen. This was the relentless, grinding reality for classical rulers, a psychological burden so immense it warped personalities, corroded trust, and often forged a tyrant from the promise of a just leader. The coronation wasn't a culmination. It was the moment the trapdoor swung open beneath their feet, and they spent the rest of their reigns trying to avoid the fall into oblivion or assassination. The constant, low hum of existential threat fostered a culture of deep-seated paranoia that became a defining feature of imperial courts. It wasn't necessarily a sign of madness, but a rational, if horrifying, response to a world where the stakes of a single mistake were not just your job, but your life and the obliteration of your entire lineage. We see this corrosive effect most vividly in the dramatic downfalls of emperors like Caligula and Nero. Both began their rules under a wave of immense public optimism. Caligula, young and charismatic, was hailed as a breath of fresh air after the dour Tiberius. Nero, championed by the philosopher Seneca, promised a return to clemency and artistic virtue. Their coronations were full of hope, yet that hope quickly curdled into something dark and violent. Modern historians often analyze this transformation not as a sudden descent into innate madness, but as a pathological response to the unbearable pressures of their office. The fear of betrayal, first planted during the tense rituals of their accession, grew into an all-consuming obsession. Caligula, after a severe illness that may have made him feel vulnerable, became convinced of plots everywhere. He turned on his supporters, executing former allies on the flimsiest of suspicions, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic and brutal as he sought to project an image of untouchable, god-like power to compensate for his deep-seated insecurities. His extreme actions were those of a man trying to terrify the world into submission because he could never truly feel safe within it. This pressure to maintain a flawless facade of divine favor and unwavering strength could manifest in two destructive ways: ruthless purges or spectacular decadence. The first was a preemptive strike against perceived enemies. It's the logic of the paranoid: if I cannot identify the traitor, I must eliminate everyone who could potentially become one. Many a Hellenistic king or Roman emperor ordered the execution of talented generals or wealthy senators, not because they had committed a crime, but simply because their competence or popularity made them a potential threat. This created a vicious cycle. Each purge created new enemies among the victims' families and allies, which in turn justified further paranoia and more violence, until the ruler was isolated in a fortress of his own making, surrounded only by sycophants and yes-men who were too afraid to tell him the truth. The second response, decadence, was a different kind of performance. By engaging in extreme, lavish, and often shocking behavior, a ruler like Nero sought to demonstrate his absolute power, his transcendence above the normal rules that governed mere mortals. His infamous artistic performances on stage were not just the hobbies of a narcissist. They were a declaration that he was so secure in his power that he could debase himself publicly without consequence, a perverse and ultimately failed attempt to project invincibility. To truly understand this psychological toll, we must look beyond the infamous tyrants to the more successful rulers, whose struggles were just as profound but better hidden. Take Augustus, the master of propaganda and control. Despite his serene public image, the historical record hints at a man deeply plagued by anxiety. He was known to suffer from severe insomnia, often restless and unable to sleep. He would frequently change his sleeping quarters, a clear sign of a man fearful of assassination, never feeling secure enough to rest in the same place twice. There are accounts of him having nightmares about his defeated rivals, his subconscious mind wrestling with the guilt and fear his waking hours so carefully suppressed. Even the most stable and successful ruler of the era was, in private, a bundle of nerves, his well-being sacrificed on the altar of power. This humanizes these distant figures, reminding us that behind the marble statues and the grand titles were real people, crushed by the impossible weight of their crowns. This ancient dynamic of power and paranoia offers a stark mirror to our own time. While modern leaders in politics or business are unlikely to face literal assassination from their board of directors or cabinet members, the psychological pressures can be strikingly similar. The constant scrutiny, the fear of public failure, the knowledge that countless rivals are waiting for a moment of weakness, the immense weight of responsibility, these are all hallmarks of high-stakes leadership today. The lesson from the classical world is not that power corrupts absolutely, but that power isolates absolutely. It builds walls between the leader and reality, feeding a paranoia that can lead to disastrous decisions, whether it's the purge of competent advisors or a retreat into a bubble of flattery and false information. The challenge, then and now, is to find a way to wield great authority without succumbing to the corrosive fear that so often accompanies it, to build structures of trust and honest counsel that can protect a leader's well-being and, by extension, the health of the state they lead. Beneath the grand spectacle of the coronation, the whispered conspiracies, and the military parades, there existed a fragile skeleton of rules, a framework of laws, customs, and institutions desperately trying to impose order on the chaotic ambition of the classical world. These weren't just guidelines, they were the bedrock of legitimacy, the script everyone was supposed to follow to prevent the transfer of power from descending into pure, bloody anarchy. Yet, as we'll see, these very structures designed for stability were often the first things twisted, broken, or outright ignored when raw ambition demanded it. The history of these legal frameworks is a story of a constant, tense tug of war between the ideal of orderly succession and the reality of political violence. In Rome, this struggle played out in the evolution of imperial succession. The Republic had clear, centuries-old laws for appointing its chief magistrates, the consuls, through elected office. But with the rise of the emperors, the old rules no longer fit. A new, unwritten constitution began to form, built on three precarious pillars: the will of the Senate, the acclaim of the military, and the aura of divine favor. In theory, the process was elegant. The Senate would officially confer power upon a new emperor, granting him a package of authorities known as the Imperium. This was then ratified by the acclamation of the legions, who swore their loyalty oaths, and finally sanctified by the priests. This system was designed to give everyone a stake: the aristocracy, the army, and the people, creating a veneer of consensus. But in practice, each of these pillars could be manipulated. The Senate's approval was often extracted under duress or simply fabricated after the fact. The military's acclaim was frequently purchased with massive cash bonuses, the infamous donativum, and divine favor could be manufactured through state-controlled propaganda. The law became a rubber stamp for whoever had the most soldiers at the gates of the city. A perfect example of this legal fiction is the Lex de Imperio Vespasiani, the law conferring power upon Vespasian. This remarkable bronze inscription, fragments of which survive to this day, is a breathtaking piece of political theater. It was passed by the Senate in the year 69 AD, a year of civil war that had seen 4 different emperors rise and fall. The law formally granted Vespasian all the traditional powers of the emperor, but read between the lines and its true purpose is revealed: to legally sanitize a military coup. Vespasian had won the throne through force of arms. His eastern legions had marched on Rome and defeated his rivals. The Lex de Imperio was the Senate's attempt to dress this raw military victory in the respectable toga of law. It was an admission that the institution's role was not to choose the emperor, but to legally bless the man the army had already chosen. It revealed a profound truth. In the face of determined ambition and military might, legal norms were incredibly fragile, often just a thin layer of paint over the brutal realities of power. Now compare this Roman model to the experience of the Greek polis, the independent city-states. Here, the frameworks were often more participatory, at least in theory. In democratic Athens, for instance, leadership wasn't about coronation in the monarchical sense. Generals, known as strategoi, were elected annually by the public assembly. This was a coronation by ballot box, where legitimacy flowed from the people. In Sparta, the process was different but equally institutionalized, with its unique dual kingship and powerful council of elders, the gerousia, providing a check on royal power. These systems were designed to prevent any single individual from seizing absolute control, but they too were vulnerable. The democratic process in Athens could be swayed by demagogues, charismatic speakers who manipulated public opinion for their own ends. And all too often, these democratic or oligarchic frameworks were violently overthrown by coups that installed tyrants. These tyrants weren't always despotic in the modern sense. Many were popular leaders who rose to power by championing the cause of the common people against the aristocracy. But their ascent always involved bypassing or shattering the existing legal institutions, proving that even systems built on popular consent could collapse when a determined faction decided to play by its own rules. This constant tension between law and ambition forces us to ask a difficult question that echoes into our own time. Why do institutions fail? The classical world provides a clear answer. Institutions are only as strong as the collective commitment to uphold them. A constitution, whether written on bronze or parchment, is just words if the most powerful people in society decide they are no longer bound by it. Laws work through a shared fiction. We all agree to pretend that this piece of paper has real authority over us. That fiction collapses the moment a general with loyal troops decides his personal ambition is more important than the rules, or when a wealthy oligarch decides he can bribe his way to the outcome he desires. The legal frameworks of the classical age were repeatedly broken not because they were poorly designed, but because they lacked a crucial enforcement mechanism independent of the very people they were meant to restrain. The army was both the guarantor of the state and its greatest potential threat, creating a vicious cycle where the institution meant to protect the law could also be the very instrument of its destruction. Yet, the enduring fascination of this struggle is seeing how these failed frameworks were always rebuilt, repurposed, and remembered. Even the most brutal military dictator, after seizing power by the sword, almost always felt compelled to seek some form of legal ratification from the Senate or a public vote. They needed the law's blessing, however coerced, to transform from a mere warlord into a legitimate ruler. This tells us something profound about the human need for order and legitimacy. It reveals that the idea of the law, the dream of a stable and predictable system for transferring power, was so powerful that even those who violated it paid it the homage of hypocrisy. They understood that while armies could win a throne, only the semblance of law could make it durable, creating a legacy that could be passed down and accepted by the next generation. This dance between breaking the rules and then desperately trying to glue the pieces back together is a timeless political drama, one that continues to play out in modern nations where constitutions are tested by autocracies and the peaceful transfer of power cannot be taken for granted. While the grand spectacles of Coronation Day were fleeting, their images were designed to endure, carved into stone, cast in precious metals, and woven into the very poetry of the age. Art and literature became the permanent record, the controlled narrative that could either glorify a ruler for eternity or serve as a subtle, subversive critique of the corrupting nature of power itself. These creations were far more than decoration. They were a central battleground in the war for hearts and minds, a way to communicate complex political messages to everyone from the most educated senator to the illiterate street vendor. A single piece of carved gemstone or a line in a tragic play could carry more weight than a legion of soldiers, shaping how a reign would be remembered long after the cheering crowds had dispersed. One of the most masterful pieces of this imperial propaganda is the Gemma Augustea, a breathtaking two-layered onyx cameo from the early 1st century. It's a small object, but its visual power is immense. The scene is divided into two registers, a common device to separate the divine from the mortal. In the upper section, we see Augustus, enthroned and majestic, being crowned by the goddess Oikumene, who represents the entire inhabited world. Beside him sits the goddess Roma, and the Capricorn symbol of his birth sign floats overhead. He is not just a man receiving a crown, he is being welcomed as an equal among the gods, his rule sanctified and eternal. Below, Roman soldiers erect a trophy of captured armor, and captive barbarians are dragged before them. The message is brilliantly clear and accessible to anyone who saw it. Augustus's divinely ordained rule is the direct cause of Roman military victory and global domination. There is no blood, no struggle, no hint of the civil wars that brought him to power, only serene, celestial order. An art historian would point out that every element, from the specific gods chosen to the idealized, youthful features of Augustus, was a deliberate code. This wasn't a portrait, it was a political manifesto in miniature, designed to be worn by an elite supporter and shown to others, a portable piece of state propaganda that whispered of divine right and inevitable victory. But for every official piece of art that celebrated power, there was a counter-narrative in the theater, a space where playwrights could explore the darker side of ambition. The great tragedians of Greece, like Euripides, used the distant, mythical past as a safe mirror to reflect on the political anxieties of their own time. While not depicting historical coronations directly, Their plays are filled with the themes of toxic hubris that erupt when a ruler believes their power makes them invincible. Consider a play like the Bacchae, where the young King Pentheus arrogantly denies the divinity of the god Dionysus and attempts to suppress his worship. His refusal to acknowledge a power higher than his own leads directly to his gruesome dismemberment at the hands of his own mother. For an Athenian audience watching this play, the message was a stark warning about the dangers of a leader who oversteps, who forgets that they are subject to the same divine laws and human frailties as everyone else. The stage became a public forum for processing the collective fear of tyrannical power, a way to critique the very structures of authority that the art in the temples glorified. It was a safety valve, allowing citizens to explore the catastrophic human cost of ambition in a fictional space, which perhaps made it easier to navigate the very real political dangers they faced outside the theater. This dual role of art to both celebrate and critique highlights its immense power as a tool of mass communication. In a world where literacy was limited, visual symbols were a universal language. A coin minted with the profile of a new emperor, wearing the corona civica, the civic crown for saving Roman citizens, wasn't just currency. It was a tiny, circulating billboard that carried his image and a message of his benevolence into every corner of the empire, every market, and every hand. A grand relief sculpture on a triumphal arch showing a barbarian chieftain submitting to the emperor didn't need a caption. It instantly communicated ideas of conquest, superiority, and pacification to every citizen who passed through the forum, regardless of whether they could read a single word. Artists were essential craftsmen of the state's ideology, and their work was instrumental in transforming a military leader into a god-like figure in the public consciousness. This ancient relationship between art and power invites us to look critically at our own modern media landscape. When we see a meticulously staged presidential inauguration broadcast across every network, with its specific camera angles focusing on the awe of the crowd and the solemnity of the oath, are we not watching a direct descendant of the Gemma Augustea? The carefully curated photo ops, the official portraits, the political ads that tell a streamlined story of leadership, these are all tools in the same ancient toolkit, designed to craft a narrative and shape public perception. The question is whether modern art, in its many forms, still holds onto that subversive, critical power of a Greek tragedy. Can a film, a novel, or a television show today effectively critique the hubris of our leaders and make us question the official story? Or has the sheer volume of state and corporate-sponsored imagery drowned out those critical voices? The classical world reminds us that art is never truly neutral. It is either upholding an existing power structure or challenging it, and being aware of that battle is the first step to understanding the true story behind the crown. While the grand stages of classical coronations were often dominated by men in military regalia or priestly robes, to focus solely on them is to miss half the story, and often the more fascinating half. The political dramas unfolding in the shadows and the back rooms were frequently directed by women who mastered the art of power without always needing to wear the crown itself. Their influence was a subtle but potent force, woven through the intricate tapestry of family loyalty, religious duty, and shrewd diplomacy. They were the kingmakers, the advisors, the regents, and sometimes the sovereigns themselves, navigating a world designed to limit their official power with breathtaking skill and often ruthless determination. Consider the formidable Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus and the archetype of the behind-the-scenes operator. In the meticulously constructed patriarchy of Rome, a woman could not hold formal political office. But Livia demonstrated that true power rarely resides solely in official titles. After the death of her son Drusus, she focused her immense intellect and ambition on ensuring her other son, Tiberius, would succeed her husband. This was no simple task, as Augustus had his own grandsons and other potential heirs. Livia's tools were not legions or laws, but influence and information. She cultivated a vast network of clients and informants, becoming one of the most trusted advisors to the emperor himself. Historians like Cassius Dio even suggest she may have been involved in the suspicious deaths of potential rivals to Tiberius's claim, including Augustus's own grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar. Whether through poison or persuasion, her machinations were so effective that when Augustus died in 14 AD, it was Livia who controlled the narrative, allegedly delaying the announcement until Tiberius could securely take control. She became the first woman to be given the title of Augusta, a recognition of her sacrosanct status, and she wielded that dignity as a political weapon for the rest of her long life, proving that a woman's authority could be built through motherhood, proximity to power, and a masterful understanding of palace politics. In stark contrast to Livia's shadowy influence stood Cleopatra VII, a queen who understood that her power needed to be spectacularly visible to be legitimate. Her coronation was not a passive event but an active performance of divine kingship. She didn't just participate in Egyptian religious ceremony, she fully embodied the goddess Isis, the mother of the nation and wife of the resurrected god Osiris. By framing herself as the living incarnation of a beloved deity, she tapped into a deep well of cultural and religious authority that transcended her political role. This was a brilliant strategy for a Hellenistic queen ruling an ancient Egyptian populace. Her imagery on temple walls showed her making offerings to the gods not as a supplicant, but as their divine equal. This very public, religiously charged persona was a crucial source of her power, allowing her to negotiate from a position of strength with Roman generals like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She presented herself not as a vulnerable woman ruler, but as the goddess queen of a wealthy and powerful nation, a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. Her coronation was a continuous act of political theater designed to consolidate her power both at home and abroad. Beyond these famous examples, women found authority in other, more institutionalized roles. In Sparta, women enjoyed a remarkably public and influential status compared to their Athenian counterparts, because Spartan men were almost permanently engaged in military training or warfare. Women managed the estates, controlled finances, and inherited property. This economic independence gave them significant political clout. While they didn't have a formal vote in the assembly, their voices carried immense weight in shaping public opinion and influencing policy. A Spartan mother's role in the agoge, the brutal state education system, was to raise sons who were physically tough and loyal to the state. Her famous send-off to her son going to war was to hand him his shield and say, "Come back with it or on it." This was a very public, ceremonial reinforcement of Spartan values, where women were active enforcers of the militaristic culture that defined the state. Their influence was woven into the very fabric of Spartan identity, making them powerful stakeholders in the stability and success of the regime. However, this exercise of female power, whether overt or covert, almost always provoked a fierce backlash from traditionalists who saw it as a dangerous subversion of the natural order. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius frequently portrayed powerful women like Livia or Agrippina the Younger as scheming, manipulative, and monstrously ambitious nouns rarely applied to their male counterparts engaged in identical behavior. This negative framing was a tool to discredit them and delegitimize their influence. When a woman's political maneuvering failed, the consequences could be disproportionately severe. The involvement of a royal woman in a failed plot often led not just to her execution, but to a posthumous character assassination that painted her as inherently corrupt or hysterical, a warning to other women who might dare to step beyond their prescribed roles. This created a precarious tightrope for women in power. They had to be effective enough to maintain influence, but subtle enough to avoid appearing to challenge male authority directly, lest they trigger a violent reaction from the very system they were trying to navigate. This glimpse into the classical world forces us to confront some enduring questions about gender and leadership. The strategies employed by Livia, Cleopatra, and Spartan matrons mastering informal networks, leveraging religious and cultural symbolism, exercising influence through motherhood, are they really so different from the challenges faced by women in power today? While the barriers may be more subtle now, the scrutiny is often just as intense, the criticism still frequently laced with gendered language questioning their ambition, their tone, or their likability in ways seldom applied to men. The classical world shows us that women have always been central to the politics of power, even when history has tried to write them out of the narrative. Their stories are a testament to the fact that leadership has never been a solely male pursuit, but a complex game where influence has always flowed through many channels, both seen and unseen. But behind the dazzling spectacle of the coronation, behind the roar of the crowd and the gleam of the crown, lay a brutal economic reality. These events were phenomenally expensive undertakings, massive financial gambles where a ruler wagered the state's entire treasury on a single day's pageantry in the hope of buying lasting loyalty. The funding for this splendor had to come from somewhere, and where it came from and who ultimately benefited was a calculation as delicate and dangerous as any political alliance. A coronation could be a powerful economic stimulus, pouring wealth into the hands of builders, artisans, and the common people, or it could be an act of catastrophic extraction, draining a kingdom's resources and planting the seeds of its own destruction. The scale of spending was truly staggering. We're not just talking about a large party, we're talking about the ancient equivalent of funding a moon landing or hosting multiple Olympic Games simultaneously. A new emperor might commission the construction of a new temple or a monumental arch to commemorate his accession. He would fund weeks of public games, featuring gladiatorial combats, chariot races, and theatrical performances, all offering free admission and free food to the populace. The distribution of largesse, the congyrium, was a direct cash handout to every eligible citizen. Then there were the immense donatives to the army, the literal price of their loyalty. Historians estimate that the total cost of a major imperial coronation in Rome could consume a significant portion of the annual state revenue. To put that in perspective, it would be like a modern government spending the equivalent of its entire annual defense or healthcare budget on a single inaugural ceremony. This spending wasn't discretionary. It was seen as a critical investment in political stability, a necessary cost of doing the business of rule. The source of this money was a political statement in itself. The most politically astute rulers funded their coronations through the spoils of war, the plundered gold, silver, and art from conquered nations. This was the ideal scenario. It demonstrated military prowess, enriched the state, and allowed the new ruler to play the generous benefactor without directly taxing their own people. However, when such windfalls weren't available, the treasury had to be tapped. This meant using funds that had been accumulated through heavy taxation of the provinces or from the state's monopolies on resources like Egyptian grain or Spanish mines. A coronation funded by taxing distant, subjugated peoples was one thing, but if it required new levies on the heartland of the empire, it risked immediate backlash. The line between being seen as a magnificent patron and a wasteful spendthrift was perilously thin, and it was a line that many rulers failed to navigate. Perhaps no single example illustrates this precarious balance better than the early reign of the Emperor Nero. His accession was initially met with great popularity, fueled in no small part by his extravagant promises and open-handed generosity. He staged incredibly lavish games and public banquets, and his cash gifts to the people and the army were unprecedented in their scale. For a time, it worked brilliantly. He was the darling of the Roman mob, but this populist spending came at a devastating cost. The imperial treasury, carefully managed by his predecessor Claudius, began to hemorrhage money. As the financial strain became acute, Nero resorted to a series of desperate and deeply unpopular measures. He was accused of debasing the currency, reducing the precious metal content in coins to stretch the supply, a move that effectively caused inflation and eroded the savings of ordinary citizens. He allegedly confiscated the estates of wealthy senators on trumped-up charges to seize their assets. This sudden shift from incredible generosity to predatory fiscal policy turned the very people who had cheered him into a hostile mob. The financial reckoning for his coronation largesse became a central factor in the erosion of his support and his eventual downfall, proving that you could indeed buy love, but the debt always came due with devastating interest. This ancient tension between ceremonial splendor and fiscal responsibility is not some relic of a distant past. It echoes powerfully in the deliberations of modern governments every time a major public event is planned. When a nation hosts a global sporting event or a royal wedding, the same debate erupts. Proponents argue for the intangible benefits of national pride, soft power, and economic stimulus for the tourism and construction industries. Critics decry the opportunity cost, arguing that the billions spent on a fleeting spectacle could have been used to build hospitals, fund schools, or repair crumbling infrastructure. Political calculation is identical to that faced by a Roman emperor. Will the public perceive this spending as a glorious celebration of national identity, or as a tone-deaf extravagance while they struggle with the cost of living? A modern leader's popularity can be made or broken by this perception, just as it was for Nero. The lesson from the classical age is that economic policy is always political policy, and how a leader chooses to spend the public's money is the clearest signal of who they truly value and what they ultimately prioritize. The final echoes of the coronation hymns had barely faded when the most dangerous phase of a ruler's journey began. The pageantry was over, the real work of power consolidation had just started. This was the perilous aftermath, a window of time where every decision could either cement a dynasty or unravel it with terrifying speed. A new leader, however divinely anointed, knew that the loyalty bought with ceremony and coin was fickle, and that the true test of their reign was not in the crowning, but in the ruthless and calculated days that followed. It was a period for balancing the ledger of power, for rewarding friends and neutralizing enemies, all while projecting an image of unshakable control to a watching world. Consider the starkly different paths taken by two Roman emperors. Vespasian, emerging victorious from the brutal Year of the Four Emperors in 69 AD, faced an empire shattered by civil war and financial ruin. His genius in the post-coronation period was his focus on reconciliation and stability. Instead of launching a wide-ranging purge of his former enemies, he focused on key threats while offering clemency to those who would swear loyalty. He famously filled the depleted treasury through practical, if unglamorous, means, even taxing public urinals, leading his son Titus to complain about the smell of the money. With these funds, he launched massive public works projects, including the Great Flavian Amphitheater, what we know as the Colosseum. This provided employment, stimulated the economy, and gave the people of Rome a magnificent symbol of the new Flavian dynasty's power and generosity. He was consolidating through construction, healing the state's wounds by giving it something magnificent to look forward to. In devastating contrast, we have the early reign of Caligula. He too began with a wave of immense public goodwill, the beloved young son of the popular Germanicus. His first acts were merciful and prudent, promising a return to traditional government after the tyranny of Tiberius. But this promise swiftly curdled into a paranoid nightmare. Convinced of plots everywhere, he turned on the very supporters who had cheered his accession. He orchestrated show trials to seize the estates of wealthy senators, executed former allies on the flimsiest of suspicions, and humiliated the Praetorian guard that protected him. His actions were not strategic purges to eliminate genuine threats. They were the erratic spasms of a man consumed by the fear that his power was illegitimate. He alienated every pillar of Roman society, the aristocracy, the military, and the people, transforming his honeymoon period into a reign of terror that ensured his own violent demise just 4 years later. The strategies employed in this delicate phase were a dark art. Appointing loyalists to key governorships and military commands was standard practice, a way to ensure control over the empire's levers of power. But the most effective rulers understood the power of diversion. Launching a foreign military campaign was a classic tactic. A victorious war could unite a fractured populace behind a common cause, glorify the new ruler as a triumphant commander, and most practically, keep the army occupied and loyal with the promise of plunder and glory. It channeled aggressive ambitions outward, away from domestic conspiracies. Conversely, within the treacherous courts of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the tools of consolidation were often more intimate and just as deadly. The post-coronation period for a Ptolemaic pharaoh might involve a dynastic marriage to a sibling to shore up their joint claim to the throne, followed swiftly by the quiet assassination of other, more distant relatives who could present a rival claim. The palace walls, still echoing with celebratory hymns, could soon witness the silent footsteps of poisoners and assassins, ensuring the new regime's security through the absolute certainty of an empty nursery or a suddenly vacant court position. This historical dance of reward and retribution forces us to look at our own time with a critical eye. When a modern leader is elected or inaugurated, they too enter a honeymoon period, a time of heightened political capital and public goodwill. How do they spend it? Do they, like Vespasian, pursue unifying projects and pragmatic reforms that build broad, lasting coalitions? Or do they, like Caligula, succumb to partisan vindictiveness, purging the bureaucracy of perceived enemies and using their power to settle scores, thereby fracturing their support and guaranteeing gridlock and backlash? The ancient lesson is clear. The aftermath of gaining power is far more important than the act itself. Lasting authority is never inherited from a ceremony. It is built day by day through a combination of strategic grace and calculated strength, by rewarding loyalty without appearing weak and neutralizing opposition without appearing tyrannical. It is the ultimate test of statecraft, where a leader's true character is revealed not by the crown they wear, but by the choices they make when the crowd finally goes home. Now imagine a coronation where the usual scents of incense and flowers are overpowered by the smell of smoke from funeral pyres, and the roar of the crowd is replaced by the fearful silence of a city gripped by plague. This was the terrifying reality for a ruler ascending the throne during a crisis. In times of war, pestilence, or economic collapse, the delicate political calculus of a coronation was upended. The ceremony was no longer just about legitimacy. It became a primal test of a leader's ability to project hope and control in the face of overwhelming chaos. where a single misstep could shatter public confidence and invite immediate rebellion. The coronation of Marcus Aurelius in the year 161 offers a powerful case study. He assumed power just as the first waves of the Antonine Plague, likely a devastating outbreak of smallpox or measles brought back by legions from the east, began to ravage the Roman Empire. This was not a time for the traditional extravagant games and lavish public feasts. Historians believe the ceremonies were significantly scaled back, not as a sign of weakness, but as a sober acknowledgement of the public's suffering. Yet this restraint was itself a calculated message. The rhetoric surrounding his accession was meticulously crafted to emphasize not conquest or glory, but resilience, duty, and divine protection. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, was presented as the steady hand at the helm during a storm, a leader chosen by the gods precisely because of his wisdom and stoic character to guide Rome through its trial. Priests would have emphasized sacrifices pleading for divine intervention, framing the new emperor as the crucial intermediary between a frightened populace and the angry gods. The coronation became a somber vow, a public promise that order would be restored from the chaos, transforming the event from a celebration into a collective act of defiance against the despair all around them. A desperate population, terrified and looking for answers, created a dangerous opportunity for a new ruler. A crisis could be exploited to justify a dramatic expansion of power that would be unthinkable in peaceful times. The same frightened citizens who might normally resist authoritarian measures could willingly accept them if packaged as necessary for survival and security. A new emperor could use the moment to centralize control over grain supplies, impose harsh new taxes for defense, or enact special laws that bypassed traditional senatorial approval, all under the banner of emergency measures. Furthermore, a classic and tragically effective tactic was to redirect public fear and anger onto a scapegoat. By blaming a minority group, early Christians were frequent targets, accused of angering the gods, or a foreign enemy for the crisis. A ruler could create a unifying target for the people's rage. This manufactured external threat served to consolidate their own power, creating a siege mentality, where questioning the leader was equated with aiding the enemy. The coronation speech in such a context was less an acceptance of office and more a declaration of war on an internal or external foe, a powerful tool for forging a brittle, fear-based unity. Yet, for the most skillful leaders, a crisis coronation could also be a unique moment to build a deeper, more authentic form of legitimacy. When handled with genuine empathy and strategic competence, leading through a shared tragedy could forge an unbreakable bond between a ruler and the people. If the new leader was seen to share in the sacrifices, perhaps by donating their own wealth to public relief efforts, as Marcus Aurelius did, or by visibly risking their own safety, it could transform them from a distant figurehead into a true leader. The rhetoric shifted from boasts of power to promises of renewal and salvation. The coronation was framed as a turning point, the end of the old era of misfortune and the dawn of a new age of recovery. This message of hope, if backed by concrete action, could unite a shattered society behind a common purpose, creating a powerful reservoir of goodwill that could sustain a reign for decades. The key was authenticity. Citizens in a crisis have a heightened sensitivity for hypocrisy, and a leader who merely used the suffering for political theater would be quickly seen through and rejected. This ancient playbook for leadership in a crisis feels unnervingly relevant today. When a modern president is inaugurated during an economic recession or a global pandemic, the same dynamics are at play. The ceremony is stripped of some of its usual pomp. The speeches are laden with themes of resilience and collective spirit, and the new leader is immediately granted or seeks expanded executive powers to address the emergency. They must perform a delicate balancing act, projecting unwavering confidence to calm markets and citizens, while also showing enough empathy to acknowledge the very real pain and fear people are experiencing. The decision to unite the nation against a common challenge or to divisively blame a political opponent or foreign power is a choice as old as Rome itself. The lesson from the classical world is that a coronation during a crisis is the ultimate pressure cooker for leadership. It reveals a ruler's true character instantly, forging them into either a revered figure of national salvation or a despised opportunist who is quickly cast aside. It is in these moments of profound uncertainty that the deadly politics of power are most starkly revealed, setting the stage for how their legacy and the legacy of the ceremonies that define them would be remembered for centuries to come. The echoes of those classical ceremonies did not fade with the fall of Rome. They reverberated through the centuries, their core elements meticulously repackaged for new empires and new eras. The intricate dance of power, religion, and public spectacle invented on the floors of Roman temples and Hellenistic palaces became the foundational blueprint for Western coronations for the next 1500 years. When we look at the crowning of a medieval king or a Renaissance pope, we are not seeing a new tradition being born, but a direct descendant of those ancient rituals, adapted to a Christian world but still pulsating with the same deadly political stakes. Perhaps the most direct lineage can be traced to the Byzantine Empire, which saw itself as the uninterrupted continuation of Rome. Byzantine coronation ceremonies were breathtakingly complex affairs that fused Roman imperial tradition with profound Christian theology. The emperor was no longer just the Pontifex Maximus. He was God's chosen vice-regent on earth, the crucial moment of anointing with holy chrism, a practice with roots in the Old Testament, was seamlessly grafted onto the Roman ceremonial framework. This sacred act, performed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, was meant to signify that the emperor's authority came directly from God, making his person semi-sacred and his rule theoretically unquestionable. Yet, this very sanctity created the same paradoxical vulnerability it had in the classical world. If the emperor's power was divine, then any challenge to it was not just treason, but heresy, a sin against God himself. This dramatically raised the stakes, justifying both the emperor's absolute power and the extreme brutality with which rivals were suppressed. The Byzantine court became a legendary hotbed of intrigue, where blinding, conjuring, and imprisoning rival claimants in monasteries were standard practice for neutralizing the divinely sanctioned competition. The politics were just as deadly. The symbols had simply been baptized. This model of sacred kingship then traveled west, profoundly shaping the coronation rituals of emerging European monarchies. The ceremony for crowning a Holy Roman Emperor, developed over centuries, was a spectacular piece of political theater that would have felt intimately familiar to a Roman general. It involved a journey to Rome, acclamation by the people and the army, now represented by German princes and Italian nobles, and a sacred anointing by the Pope himself. This last element introduced a new and volatile power dynamic, the tension between temporal and spiritual authority. Who truly held the power, the emperor being crowned, or the pope who placed the crown on his head? This struggle between church and state, played out on the coronation stage, led to centuries of conflict, excommunications, and even wars. The ceremony was not merely a celebration. It was a negotiation, a public definition of the boundaries of power, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. The crown itself became a potent symbol of this struggle, as seen in the Iron Crown of Lombardy or the Imperial Crown of the Holy Roman Empire, their very craftsmanship proclaiming a fusion of ancient Roman authority with Christian sanctity. The concept of the divine right of kings, which reached its zenith in the early modern era with absolute monarchs like Louis XIV of France, is unthinkable without its classical and late antique precursors. The idea that a monarch is accountable not to his people but to God alone is a direct, if exaggerated, inheritance from the theocratic rulership of the Byzantine emperors and the divine pretensions of figures like Alexander the Great. Louis's famous declaration, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state," is the ultimate expression of this belief, a philosophy that found its most powerful expression in his magnificent coronation at Rheims. There he was anointed with the same holy oil supposedly delivered from heaven for the coronation of Clovis, the first king of the Franks. This was not just tradition, it was a calculated political statement meant to place the king beyond earthly reproach. Yet, as in the classical age, this claim of divine mandate was a double-edged sword. It insulated the monarch from criticism, but it also meant that any national catastrophe, a famine, a military defeat, a plague could be interpreted by the populace as a sign of God's displeasure with the king personally. The very ideology designed to make him unassailable could become the source of his undoing, fueling the popular anger that would eventually explode in events like the French Revolution. So has the core dynamic truly changed? When a modern president stands on the steps of the Capitol, places a hand on a Bible, and takes an oath to uphold the Constitution, are we witnessing a break from this ancient past or merely its latest iteration? The religious symbolism, while now often ecumenical, remains potent. The military display is still there, in the form of a formal parade and a salute from the armed forces. The public acclamation has shifted from the roar of the Roman mob to the approval ratings measured by opinion polls and the cheers of an invited audience. The political risks, while thankfully less often fatal, are no less real. A botched inauguration speech, a perceived sign of disrespect during the oath, or a failure to project confidence and unity can cripple a new administration before it even begins, leaving it vulnerable to political opponents and media scrutiny. The transfer of power remains the most vulnerable moment in any political system, and the ceremony surrounding it is still a carefully choreographed performance designed to minimize that vulnerability and project an image of seamless legitimacy. The daggers may be metaphorical now, but the ambition and the intrigue are eternal. We have not abolished the ancient politics of coronation. We have simply civilized them, swapping the poison cup for the poison pen and the assassin's blade for the devastating leak to the press. It's tempting to view the deadly politics of classical coronations as a distant drama, a relic of a more brutal and superstitious age. But if we listen closely, the echoes from those ancient plazas and temples are unmistakable in the rituals of power that unfold all around us today. The stage has changed, the costumes are different, but the fundamental playbook for securing legitimacy and navigating the transfer of authority remains strikingly familiar. Consider the modern presidential inauguration. While we thankfully no longer expect assassins in the crowd, the core elements are a direct inheritance from Rome. There is the solemn oath-taking, a secular version of a sacred vow, promising to uphold the laws of the land. There is the military parade, a demonstration of force and loyalty from the nation's protectors. There is the address to the people, a speech meticulously crafted to project strength, unity, and a vision for the future, broadcast not to a crowd of thousands but to millions through digital media. And just like a Roman emperor wary of the Praetorian Guard, a new president must immediately secure the loyalty of the vast federal bureaucracy and intelligence agencies, knowing that leaks and internal resistance can be as damaging as any ancient betrayal. The tools of propaganda have evolved from carved cameos and minted coins into a 24/7 news cycle and a sprawling social media ecosystem. A classical ruler employed court poets to craft an epic narrative of their divine right. A modern leader relies on communications directors, campaign advertisers, and digital strategists to shape their public image. The goal is identical: to control the story. Negative press is spun, achievements are amplified, and opponents are framed as dangerous radicals, much like Mark Antony was portrayed as a drunken Oriental devotee of a foreign queen. Social media, in particular, has become the new forum for public acclamation and damnatio memoriae, where a leader can be built up by supporters and torn down by critics in an instant, their digital likeness celebrated or erased with a viciousness that would feel familiar to a Roman senator. Even the phenomenon of the influencer, suddenly crowned with millions of followers and lucrative brand deals, mirrors the precarious rise of a Hellenistic prince dependent on the fleeting favor of the mob and the backing of powerful corporate patrons. The deadly risks have also transformed, though not vanished. While the threat of a poison-tipped dagger has largely receded, the security concerns are more complex than ever. The assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan in 1981, or the violent storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, are stark reminders that the transition of power remains a moment of extreme vulnerability. Modern security details are the evolution of the Praetorian Guard, a necessary barrier between the leader and the public, but their presence also creates the same old tension between accessibility and safety. Leaders must perform visibility and connection while being shielded from harm, a balancing act that Philip II of Macedon failed catastrophically. Furthermore, the threats are no longer just physical. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns funded by foreign adversaries, and the weaponization of deepfake technology represent a new frontier of danger, a digital poisoning of the well of public information designed to destabilize a regime before it can even find its footing. So what can we learn from how the classical world handled these eternal challenges? The lessons are profound. We can look to Augustus and see the immense value of building institutional legitimacy rather than relying solely on personal loyalty, a lesson for modern corporations where a cult of personality around a charismatic CEO often leads to chaos upon their departure. We can see in the downfall of Caligula the catastrophic cost of ruling by paranoia and purges, a warning for any leader who isolates themselves in an echo chamber of sycophants and attacks the very institutions meant to provide stability. The Hellenistic kingdoms teach us that complex power-sharing arrangements and dynastic politics are inherently unstable, a relevant insight for understanding the volatile successions in certain modern nations today. And perhaps most importantly, the classical age reminds us that the health of any state depends on a delicate balance. A leader must be strong enough to govern effectively, but their power must be checked by other forces, whether a senate, a free press, an independent judiciary, or an engaged citizenry, to prevent the descent into the tyranny that so often followed the absolute power claimed during those ancient, deadly coronations. Beneath the gilded spectacle of the coronation and the brutal calculus of power lay a profound and unsettling ethical void. How does a society justify the bloodshed often required to place a crown on a single head? The deadly politics of these ceremonies forced every participant, from the ruler to the priest to the common citizen, to confront a series of agonizing moral dilemmas that continue to resonate today. At the heart of it all was the most potent justification for rule, divine will. To claim a god had chosen you was to place your authority beyond human reproach, but it also meant twisting faith into a weapon of control. This sanctification of power allowed rulers to frame any opposition not just as treason, but as sacrilege, justifying horrific violence against their own people in the name of heavenly order. The ethical cost of this was staggering. It asked a population to surrender their critical judgment, to accept that the whims of a fallible man were the undisputed commands of the divine, creating a system where questioning authority became synonymous with sin. This manipulation of faith for political ends did not go unchallenged in the ancient world. Philosophers like Seneca the Younger, who served as an advisor to the Emperor Nero, and Cicero, the great orator of the Roman Republic, offered piercing critiques of this corruption. Seneca, writing in his moral essays, constantly grappled with the nature of power. He argued that true leadership was a form of public service, a responsibility to be exercised with wisdom and virtue for the good of the governed, not for the glory of the ruler. He saw the rampant cruelty and paranoia of the imperial court not as a necessary evil, but as a catastrophic failure of character, a descent into tyranny that poisoned the soul of the individual and the state alike. Cicero, even earlier, championed the idea of a republic governed by laws, not men. He warned against the concentration of absolute power in one person, arguing that without checks and balances, even the most well-intentioned leader could be corrupted. Their philosophy suggests that a system built on fear and divine pretense is inherently unstable and unjust, for it replaces reasoned debate with enforced dogma and replaces justice with the will of the strongest. We see these ethical choices play out in the starkly different legacies of classical rulers. Consider the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. He spent much of his reign on distant military campaigns, defending the empire's borders. His personal writings, known as the Meditations, are a profound exploration of his own duty, his frustrations, and his constant struggle to rule with stoic virtue amidst the immense temptations of absolute power. He chose, often at great personal and political cost, to try and govern by principle. Contrast this with his son and successor, Commodus. Abandoning his father's sense of duty, Commodus used the throne as a personal playground, performing as a gladiator in the arena and demanding to be worshipped as the god Hercules. He chose ruthless self-indulgence over principled rule, a decision that led to his assassination and plunged the empire into a period of violent civil war. Their stories present a clear ethical dichotomy. One leader saw power as a burden to be borne for the common good, while the other saw it as a prize to be exploited for personal glory. The legacy of each choice is written indelibly in the history books. This forces us to confront the timeless tension between stability and freedom. Many citizens of the Roman Empire, weary of the brutal civil wars that preceded Augustus's rise, willingly traded their political freedoms for the stability, peace, and prosperity his autocratic rule provided. This is the classic bargain of the benevolent dictator, but the ethical question remains: is a safe and well-fed prison still a prison? Can stability achieved through the suppression of dissent and the concentration of power ever be truly moral? The human toll of this ambition is the darkest shadow cast by the coronation spectacle. For every Augustus who brought peace, there were countless victims, rivals, and their families executed, populations enslaved to fund the imperial machine, and generations of citizens taught to kneel rather than think. The grandeur of the ceremony was built upon a foundation of fear, oppression, and forgotten graves. The insights from these ancient struggles offer crucial guidance for our own time. The central ethical challenge remains unchanged: how to structure power in a way that minimizes its potential for abuse while maximizing its capacity to do good. The classical world teaches us that systems matter. Relying on the virtue of a single individual is a dangerous gamble. Instead, societies must strive to build institutions, independent courts, a free press, transparent elections that can hold leaders accountable regardless of their claims to divine right or popular mandate. It is about creating a culture that values ethical leadership and rewards integrity over ruthless ambition. The goal is not to eliminate power, which is impossible, but to civilize it. To create a world where the pursuit of leadership is tempered by a profound respect for justice, human dignity, and the rule of law, ensuring that the deadly politics of the classical coronation remain a relic of the past, not a blueprint for our future. This reflection on the morality of power naturally leads us to ask who, in the end, truly granted that power. Beyond the gods, the armies, and the elites, the silent, watching public always held a latent authority that could, when ignited, make or break any ruler. But for all the intricate plotting in palace corridors and the silent prayers in temples, the fate of a ruler ultimately rested on a far less predictable force: the roaring, chanting, and sometimes rioting energy of the public. To view the masses in the classical world as a passive audience is to miss the entire drama. They were the final and most volatile arbiters of power. A coronation was not complete with just the priest's anointing or the general's salute. It required the acclamation of the people, a thunderous wave of consent that could either cement a new reign or drown it before it even began. The crowd's voice was a political instrument, and every aspiring leader knew they had to learn how to play it, whether through genuine appeal, clever manipulation, or outright bribery. The Roman emperor understood this better than anyone. His relationship with the populace of Rome was a carefully choreographed dance of fear and favor, perfectly encapsulated by the famous policy of panem et circenses, bread and circuses. This wasn't just about keeping the people fed and entertained. It was a sophisticated system of crowd control and legitimacy maintenance. A new emperor, fresh from his acclamation by the Praetorian Guard, knew his first order of business was to secure the affection of the urban mob. This meant distributing a generous cash gift, the congyrium, and announcing a lavish schedule of gladiatorial games and chariot races. The historian Juvenal sarcastically noted that the common Roman had traded his political birthright for these free handouts, but his observation reveals the brutal effectiveness of the strategy. By satisfying the immediate, visceral needs of the population, a ruler could purchase a powerful, if fickle, form of popular legitimacy. The thunderous cheers that echoed through the Circus Maximus during the inaugural games were as crucial to his power as any senatorial decree. This engineered consent was a powerful tool, but it was also a trap. The public's appetite for spectacle and subsidy only grew, and an emperor who failed to deliver, or who was perceived as stingy, could quickly find that same cheering crowd turning into a vengeful mob at his gates. Yet to see the public as merely bought off is to underestimate their agency. Their support could also be a genuine and powerful political weapon, one that could be wielded from below. In the Greek world, the rise of the tyrannos, a word that originally meant simply an unconstitutional ruler, not necessarily a brutal one, was almost always fueled by popular discontent. These men were often charismatic outsiders or disaffected aristocrats who positioned themselves as champions of the common people against a corrupt and oppressive oligarchy. They seized power not through hereditary right but by rallying the demos, the citizen body, to their cause. Their coronations, often swift and violent coups, were then legitimized by public acclamation. The crowd's approval transformed an act of treason into a popular revolution. This demonstrates a crucial truth: the public wasn't always a docile recipient of top-down propaganda. They could be active participants, using their collective weight to install a leader who promised to address their economic grievances and social frustrations. The will of the people, however loosely defined, was a tangible force that could break established systems of power. This created a fascinating and dangerous feedback loop between the ruler and the ruled. Social historians point out that coronations and large public festivals were rare moments where the different classes of society, the senatorial elite, the equestrian businessmen, the common plebeians, and even slaves shared the same physical space. In these moments, the carefully maintained social hierarchy was temporarily suspended, and the collective mood of the crowd could become a single, powerful entity. A shrewd ruler would use his coronation speech not to address the senators in the front row, but to speak directly to the masses in the back. His rhetoric would be filled with promises of lower taxes, land distributions for veterans, and a tax on corrupt elites. He was performing for the gallery, and the gallery's responsive roar gave him leverage over the aristocracy. The Senate, hearing the unmistakable sound of popular support for a new emperor, would often feel compelled to fall in line, rubber stamping what the people had already ratified with their voices. In this way, the public sentiment, whether orchestrated or organic, directly influenced the highest political decisions. So where does this leave us today? In our modern democracies, we've replaced the roaring mob with the silent, private vote, and the distribution of bread and circuses with complex social welfare programs and mass entertainment industries. But have the underlying dynamics truly changed? A modern political campaign is a 2-year-long coronation ritual where candidates desperately seek the acclamation of the public through promises, pageantry, and relentless media exposure. The crowd's role has been digitized, its approval measured in polls, its anger channeled through social media trends and cable news outrage cycles. The fundamental question remains, is popular support a reflection of genuine consent and informed deliberation, or is it, as it often was in Rome, a managed commodity, carefully shaped by those in power to maintain their control? The classical world reminds us that the public is never just a spectator. It is always a participant whose collective voice, for better or worse, holds the ultimate power to crown and to uncrown. This delicate and often dangerous relationship between the leader and the led sets the stage for our final, culminating case study, where all these threads, religion, military power, economics, and popular, will converge in the coronation of a single, transformative figure. Imagine the year 312 AD. The Roman Empire is fractured, torn between 4 rival emperors vying for absolute control. One of them, Constantine, is marching his army toward Rome for a final, decisive confrontation with his bitter rival, Maxentius. The night before the battle, camped near the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly experiences a vision that will alter the course of history. In the sky, he sees a cross of light and the Greek words, Epsilon, Nu Tau Omicron Upsilon Tau letter 1 FF 3 Nu Iota Kappa Alpha. In this sign, conquer. He instructs his soldiers to paint the Chi Rho symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name, on their shields. The next day, he wins a stunning victory. This moment is more than a military triumph. It is the de facto coronation of a new kind of Roman emperor, one whose legitimacy will be inextricably linked to the Christian God. His formal accession ceremonies would later masterfully blend the old world with the new, creating a template for power that would endure for 1,000 years in Byzantium and echo throughout European history. Constantine's rise to sole emperor was a masterclass in navigating the deadly politics of religious transition. The Roman world was still overwhelmingly pagan, and its traditional aristocracy held tightly to the old gods. To openly declare for Christianity too early would have been political suicide, alienating the very armies and elites he needed to secure his throne. So he embarked on a brilliant, cautious campaign of symbolic fusion. he didn't immediately ban pagan rituals or tear down temples. Instead, he began to gradually infuse imperial iconography with Christian elements. The Roman standard, the eagle, was joined by the labarum, a military standard featuring the chi-rho symbol. Coins, the mass media of the ancient world, slowly began to shift, with some issues downplaying traditional deities and others featuring symbols that could be interpreted in multiple ways, appealing to both Christian and pagan soldiers. This was a calculated balancing act. He was signaling his support to the rapidly growing, well-organized Christian communities within the empire, who became a powerful base of loyal support, while avoiding a direct and provocative rupture with the traditional power structures that still believed Rome's greatness depended on the favor of Jupiter and Mars. His coronation wasn't a single event but a process of careful rebranding, where the emperor himself became the living symbol of a new divine covenant. The long-term implications of this fusion were nothing short of revolutionary, creating the bedrock for the Byzantine Empire and shaping medieval Europe. Constantine's actions initiated the formal partnership of church and state, a concept known as Caesaropapism, where the emperor held significant authority over the Christian church. He convened and presided over the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325, a clear demonstration that theological unity was now a matter of state security. This intertwining meant that religious orthodoxy and political loyalty became dangerously synonymous. To question the emperor's religious policy was to commit treason, and vice versa. The coronation ceremony itself evolved into a profoundly sacred rite in the Eastern Roman Empire. The simple Roman acclamation by the army and Senate was transformed into a lavish, liturgical event inside the great church of Hagia Sophia. The Patriarch of Constantinople would anoint and crown the emperor, visually demonstrating that his power was now a sacred trust from God, not from the people or the Senate. This spiritual sanction made the emperor's person semi-divine and his authority theoretically absolute, but it also made the church a permanent and powerful player in imperial politics, a relationship that would define the Byzantine world for centuries. This pivotal moment serves as the ultimate microcosm of our entire exploration into classical coronations. It showcases the timeless ability of these rituals to absorb and reflect profound social change. Constantine didn't invent a new ceremony from scratch. He did what all successful leaders do. He took the existing language of power, the Roman imperial tradition, and translated it into a new dialect that a changing population could understand and support. He understood that to rule effectively, the symbols of power must evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. The perilous nature of the ceremony remained, but the sources of its danger shifted. The threat was no longer just a rival general with a sharper sword. It was now also a rival bishop with a different interpretation of Scripture, or a populous city that saw the new faith as a betrayal of its ancient identity. The coronation of Constantine the Great stands as a monumental capstone, a dramatic point of inflection where the classical world began its long transformation into the medieval, proving that the most enduring power is not that which conquers by the sword alone, but that which successfully captures the spirit of the age and sanctifies its own authority in the process. So as our exploration of these ancient power games draws to a close, what remains is a clear and chilling realization. The coronation ceremonies of the classical age were never merely about celebration. They were the ultimate high-stakes political theater, a dangerous dance where religion was weaponized to sanctify ambition. Military might was both shield and sword. Economic resources were the currency of loyalty, and raw human aspiration could, and often did, lead to a bloody end. We've seen how a crown placed upon a ruler's head was not just a symbol of authority, but a target painted on their back, inviting conspiracies from the shadows of their own court. From the calculated pageantry of Augustus in Rome to the treacherous family dynamics of the Ptolemies in Egypt, these rituals were the critical flashpoints where empires could be solidified or shattered in an instant. The struggles we've witnessed, the quest for legitimacy, the fragile balance between security and spectacle, the manipulation of public perception, are not confined to the dust of antiquity. They are timeless human dramas that continue to play out on the modern stage. The stages may have changed from sun-drenched Roman forums to Capitol steps, and the weapons may have evolved from concealed daggers to sophisticated smear campaigns, but the core dynamics of power remain hauntingly familiar. The historian Edward Gibbon, in his monumental work on the fall of Rome, offered a warning that echoes across the centuries. The principles of a free constitution are irrecoverably lost when the legislative power is dominated by the executive. This insight cuts to the very heart of the deadly politics we've examined. It reminds us that when the careful checks and balances of a system break down, when ceremony masks consolidation and spectacle overrules scrutiny, the path to unchecked power is paved with consequences that resonate through history. This journey through the past is more than an academic exercise. It's a lens through which to view our own world. The next time you witness a modern inauguration, a leadership transition in a major corporation, or even the relentless media coverage of a new head of state, I encourage you to look for the echoes. See the ancient threads of propaganda in the curated photo opportunities. Recognize the role of economic patronage in the promises made, and sense the underlying tension between visibility and security. By engaging critically with the ceremonies of power in our own time, we become more informed citizens, better equipped to understand the narratives being constructed for us, and to safeguard the principles of accountability in our own societies. If unraveling these historical mysteries has captivated you, then you're in the right place. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Which classical coronation story fascinated you the most? Was it the divine gamble of Alexander the Great, the brutal efficiency of Augustus, or the deadly family politics of Cleopatra's court? Share your thoughts and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for